What's up, everybody? Andrew Mahone here with Darium's Competitive Pokemon, here with a standard deck profile. This is for the breakthrough through Shining Legends format. This is Drampa Garbodor. This deck did very, very well at the Vancouver regional championships that just happened this past weekend, and I think that this deck has a lot of potential going forward. It has shown itself to be just a very real contender in the last 6 months or so since the international championships. This list right here is actually based off the list that Tord has been using and been doing very well with over in Europe. And, this list here really is just very similar to those lists. I mean, really the only Shining Legends card we got in here is this Latios, which I think that Latios does bring some, some different options to the deck, and I think is good in the archetype altogether. I think this deck is just extremely consistent, extremely hard hitting, and just has a lot of different options as far as your win conditions go, and I think that's what makes it just such an attractive archetype, especially for skilled players. This deck, you can outplay your opponent in a lot of different ways. You also just have a lot of different consistent options for, what kind of routes you want to take for various matchups. And I mean, this deck is just extremely consistent. It really reminds me a lot of the Drampa Zoroark deck that I played at internationals. I mean, really, Zoroark Drampa and Drampa Garbodor are pretty similar archetypes, and they function in a pretty similar aggressive kind of way. So let's get right down to this list. Pretty stoked about this Rainbow Rare Drampa here. Just pulled this at the League Cup this past weekend. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start out with 2 copies of Drampa GX, 2 copies of Trashlands Garbodor, 2 copies of your Garbotoxin Garbodor, and 4 Trubbish. We also play 1 copy of Tapu Koko promo and 1 copy of Latios. These lists were playing 2 copies of Tapu Koko promo, but I think a 1-1 split is correct with Shining Legends legal. Also play 1 copy of Espeon EX and 3 copies of Tapu Lele GX. So let's talk about this cast that we have here. Of course, we have 2 copies of Drampa GX, and 2 copies is really all you need, though this guy does carry a lot of the weight on his back as far as heavy hitting goes. He's your early aggressor, starting off with Righteous Edge as early as turn 1. Follow it up with a Berserk attack. You can start firing those off as early as turn 2, just Berserking for 180 after 180. He can also boost the consistency of your deck with a turn 1 Big Wheel GX, or just really whenever you find yourself with a little bit of a dead hand and you'd like to boost your setup or boost your hand size, Big Wheel GX can refresh your hand in the middle of the game as well. It's extremely good for that consistency. Having 180 hit points is excellent as well, just makes it, that 1 notch higher than 170, making him a little more difficult for the opposing Pokemon to knock out. Retreat cost of 2, doesn't really end up being an issue ever. You can retreat this thing with double colorless energy. You have lots of float stones in deck. Drampa GX is just, the all-star of this list and really the backbone of what brings this whole group together. You can see that we are playing a 2-2 split of the Trashlanch and the Garbotoxin Garbodor, and I really like the 2-2 split in here. Trashlanch, though nerfed a little bit with the exiting of Versus Seeker from our format, and the fact that just Gardevoir is, becoming the best deck in format and is showing itself to just be a really top contender along with Volcanion. I mean, at Vancouver this past weekend, I think Garbodor and Gardevoir both asserted themselves to kind of be, some of those 1-2 decks in format. There was a Greninja in top 8 as well, and some Volcanion lists further down the line. But I think Gardevoir really got its stuff together this past weekend and showed that it is a top tier deck. Obviously, Trashlanch is not quite as good against Gardevoir decks, since they could just Twilight GX all their items back into the deck, but that Garbotoxin ability is still very, very good. And you will find versus a lot of different decks, they do end up getting their items in the discard pile by the end of the game. I mean, this Trashlanch attack is going to finish so many games with this deck. Just by the end of the game, while you're trying to take those last 2 prizes, if you have a Trubbish on your bench, you really are just able to evolve attach an energy, and win the game very easily just in the last couple turns of the game. I mean, you're going to be able to hit some pretty high numbers, especially with Choice Band, having that access to Trash Lance, having that access to Garbodor. I like the 2-2 split because it means that we are able to consistently get both of them out, especially with Rescue Stretcher. So really like the 2-2 split. The Acid Spray Trubbish is the one that I prefer, just being able to have the option to remove an energy from one of your opponent's Pokemon and do a little 10 damage as well. You can see that I mixed up the Tapu Koko, the 2 Tapu Kokos for a 1-1 split of Tapu Koko and Latios. I do really like the 1-1 split in here. Sometimes Tapu Koko is just who you want for being able to do 20 damage to all your opponent's Pokemon, but sometimes you'd like to be a little more selective, or you're playing against a Psychic weak deck, in which case Latios is very good as well. Some of these Drampa decks were playing Espeon GX in them, and I'm not quite as big of a fan of the Espeon GX version of Drampa-Garbodor. They were playing pretty thin line, maybe a 1-1 line, something like that. If you do find yourself up against an Espeon GX, Latios is very good. When the Buzzwole GX does come out, obviously Buzzwole GX hits your Drampa GX for weakness. It also hits your Tapu Koko for weakness. So you're going to want an attacker that's going to be able to hit Buzzwole as well. I think actually once Buzzwole GX comes out, you may just switch over to 2 copies of Latios, because Latios puts in a lot of work against Buzzwole GX. And then obviously as the game progresses and Buzzwole starts to get more items into the discard pile, you could sweep up with your Trash Lance Garbodor, hitting some one-hit knockouts as long as they get 5 or 6 items in the discard pile, factoring the fact that they're probably going to be playing Fighting Fury Belt. So Latios, very good against Buzzwole, and considering most of your deck is pretty weak to Buzzwole, that is a good option to have. I've seen that some Buzzwole lists are probably going to be playing Garbodor with them, so it's going to be this weird relation where your Latios is good against their Buzzwole, but then they have Garbodor too that could hit your Latios and your Garbodors for knockout. So you're going to want to have plenty of options to hit for Psychic Weakness. I think Psychic Weakness is going to become a pretty big and relevant thing in the format, with the release of Crimson Invasion coming forward. We also play 1 copy of Espeon EX in here for that Miraculous Shine attack, though we do have the option to Psyshock as well. I like, as far as comparing apples to apples here, this does a Psychic and a double colorless for 70 damage, as does the Latios. But this isn't affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. That very rarely comes into play. I do like, doing this attack on a non-EX, non-GX, as opposed to, an EX Pokemon. Whereas if you have 3 energies on a Latios and it gets knocked out by something like a Lele, or it gets knocked out by something like a Gardevoir, or something like that, you don't really mind. But if you put the 3 energies onto the Espeon EX and it goes down in 1 hit, that feels pretty bad. So usually just going to be using this thing for the Miraculous Shine attack. Since we do play Po-Town in here, and we do play Tapu Koko and Latios, we do have some options to devolve our opponent's Pokemon to take prizes that way. If they happen to be playing Gardevoir GX, or even Metagross, or Solgaleo, or Decidueye, decks that play these Stage 2 Pokemon, we do have the option to go in with Espeon EX. I mentioned that this deck has a lot of different options for win conditions. I like the inclusion of Espeon EX in here, that you can make your opponent kind of dig for various resources to have to heal their Pokemon and to have to get around Po-Town, because they're always worried about Espeon EX devolving their Pokemon. And then as your opponent kind of tries to scrape together these resources, trying to get rid of Garbotoxin, trying to deal with the fact that their Pokemon are getting damaged by Po-Town, they are going to be throwing items into the discard, in which case Garbodor, Trash Lance Garbodor, comes in hot with that Trash Lance attack, able to clean up the opponent's Pokemon after they've expended their resources. So, to clean things up here, we do have 3 copies of Tapu Lele GX. I really love Tapu Lele GX in here. Obviously, Energy Drive puts in work since we play double colorless energy. We also have access to Tapu Cure GX if you ever find it to be kind of an optimal moment to do that. And then Wonder Tag, just making for such a consistent backbone to this deck, being able to hand select the supporter from your list. Moving on to the supporters. We do play 4 copies of Professor Sycamore, 4 copies of N, and then I love that they are playing 4 copies of Guzma as well, and 1 Bridget. and that's it. I mean, this is consistency right here, and I love the fact that this is just such a simple supporter count. Your 4 Sycamore and 4 N combined with Drampa's Big Wheel GX is plenty of draw to get you throughout the course of the game. We are going to be locking things up with Garbotoxin Garbodor in most situations, so a lot of times you're not going to have access to your Tapu Lele towards the end of the game, but Big Wheel GX can come into play if you need to draw cards and you happen to have Garbotoxin up and maybe you can't use your own Tapu Lele. Another little cheeky thing you could do is you could Field Blow your own Floatstone off Garbodor, Wonder Tag for something, and then put another another tool back onto your Garbodor to lock up abilities again if you need to find a supporter to draw with. You could play 1 copy of Hala in here if you wanted to. I've mentioned before that Hala is like decent with Drampa, just since you can use your Big Wheel GX early, and then having the access to Hala, Shuffle Draw 8 in the middle of the game can be very powerful. So if you wanted to, you could find room for 1 copy of Hala, but I think that this supporter count is pretty proven and has been very effective in some regional, contending lists so far. This list is also playing 4 copies of Guzma. This is actually the list that I based this one off of, is the one that Ben Potter showed off. He finished in the top 10 of the Vancouver Regional Championships this past weekend, so that was pretty cool. And he was playing 4 copies of Guzma. He said that his list was based off of one that he got from Tord. Tord obviously won the International Championships, got 2nd place at Bremen Regionals as well, so his, pretty much the best Drampa-Garb player there is. And if he says that there's 4 copies of Guzma should be in this deck, I mean, I'm going to listen because he's very good and has seen a lot of success with this deck. 4 copies of Guzma, you're always going to have access to your opponent's bench Pokemon. I think the 4 Guzma strategy has shown itself to be so powerful in the Volcanion archetypes, and we're taking that same kind of logic and porting it over to Drampa Garbodor. Drampa can start off, doing Berserk for 180 as early as turn 2. Since we do play 4 copies of Floatstone, Guzma is always going to be, a live card. Even if your Drampa's in the active position, Guzma, you got a Floatstone, free retreater, Tapu Koko, free retreater, and then bring up whatever Pokemon you want on your opponent's bench and hit it for 180. Things can escalate very quickly with 4 copies of Guzma. I really love that in here. Just being able to target down threats on your opponent's bench with precision makes this a very aggressive and scary archetype to play against. 1 copy of Bridget seems to be just fine. In more setup-oriented decks, I do prefer 2 copies, but in a Stage 1 deck like this, 1 copy of Bridget definitely gets the job done. Moving on to the items, we play 4 copies of Ultra Ball, 4 copies of Choice Band, 4 copies of Floatstone, 2 Field Blower, 1 Rescue Stretcher, and 4 copies of Po-Town. This list, this just reminds me so much of the internationals lists that we're just playing lots of 4-ofs. Even just the Drampa Zoroark deck that I played to a top 8 finish at internationals, it reminds me a lot of those lists. I love the 4 choice band. That just really consistent, is really good with Drampa. You're always going to be hitting the right numbers, just being able to Berserk for 180. Also, just so good for boosting Garbodor's numbers with Trash Lance, being able to hit the right numbers. Even if your opponent has not played quite enough items in the discard pile, a quick Field Blower to remove a couple of their tools, followed by a Choice Band, can really swing things in your favor. Imagine if you remove 2 items with a Field Blower, then that's plus 40 damage, and a Choice Band plus 30 damage, you're doing a 70 damage swing. So even if they had only had 5 items in the discard pile, you Field Blower 2 tools off, Choice Band, now you're hitting 170 damage, and things just escalate so quickly, with the Choice Band and the Field Blowers, both really good in this deck. Earlier lists of Drampa Garbodor did play maybe 2 copies of Rescue Stretcher, but 1 really works just fine. Since we are playing 2 copies of Trash Lance Garbodor and 2 copies of the Ability Garbodor, you really are able to get them out consistently, and Rescue Stretcher, just having access to 1 can allow you to shuffle them back into the deck or get them from the discard pile to your hand, once during the game is plenty. I do love 4 copies of Po-Town in here. I feel like if you're going to play Po-Town, it's the kind of card where 4 is really the only count that I agree with, just because if you want to play Po-Town, you want the damage to actually rack up and to matter, then 4 is a must-have. Any less, you're probably not going to see it early, especially if you're going for a turn 1 Bridget. You're probably not going to get it consistently enough early enough that it's going to matter, because your opponents are just going to evolve up their Pokemon before you can find your Po-Town, and then you have all these Po-Towns in your deck that are essentially doing nothing. So I love 4 copies of Po-Town in here. It could really help you against decks like Garbodor GX and just other stage 2 decks against Metagross, against Decidueye. Having that damage with Po-Town combined with Tapu Koko or combined with Latios, who could both get out there with their spread attacks on the first turn of the game. And then if the opponent's Pokemon are evolving up through Po-Town, then pretty much everything is easy pickings for Drampa to sweep things up at the end of the game. Either Drampa or Trashlands Garbodor are easily going to be able to sweep up after your Po-Town and your Tapu Koko or your Latios have put in their work. 4 copies of Floatstone means that we're pretty much always going to be able to find a Floatstone to put onto our Garbodor, our Garbotoxin Garbodor to lock up abilities. Also just great for increasing the mobility of this deck. And 4 copies of Ultra Ball is pretty much just standard. You're not going to play any less than that if you want to have a consistent deck. So that's it for the items. And then to close things out, we get to look at the energy. We are playing 5 copies of Psychic Energy, like my nice e-reader energy there. Was able to dig those out for this deck. 4 copies of Double Colorless, and 3 copies of Rainbow. Notice that we don't play any way to retrieve our energies. If you really were concerned about the energy count, you could turn the Rescue Stretcher into a Super Rod, but I don't really think it's necessary. This amount of energy, has been proven in lists to be just enough. You have 8 options for Psychic Energy, 4 options for Double Colorless, and if you're careful with your resources, you can really get by using this amount of energy. However, maybe if you're a newer player or not really comfortable conserving your resources quite just yet, then maybe you add in just the Super Rod for the Rescue Stretcher. That gives you a little bit more cushion as far as your energy count goes, since you can throw your Psychic Energies back in with the Super Rod. And you also have the option to shuffle in Pokemon, so you do have that kind of dual usage out of that 1 card slot. And the Rainbow Energy in here is really just good for being able to power up Drampa in situations where you don't want to be putting down Po-Town, or if you happen to not be able to find your Po-Towns, you could slap a Rainbow Energy onto one of your bench Pokemon, put the 10 damage there, and make Drampa's Berserk attack do that whole 150, 180 with a choice band. So it is just a nice option to have. You don't have to play, 3 Rainbows in here. You could play 1, you could play 2, but, just having the consistency of being able to get an early Berserk attack and having the flexibility of not having to use your Po-Town every time you want to charge up your Drampa's Berserk attack as well is a really nice option to have. So that wraps it up for the Drampa Garbodor deck. Thank you all for watching the video. Let me know what you all think of Drampa Garbodor in the comments below. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. Peace.